This is episode 3 of All About Pulse Width Modulation, and this is our final episode. So, to recap, in the first episode, I was showing different types of pulse width modulation and how different analog synthesizers create it. Then I showed you how to create pulse width modulation using oscillator sync. And now in this video, I'm going to show you how to create pulse width modulation with a sampler engine. HD1 does not have pulse width modulation built in, but we're going to create it from scratch using some very particular techniques. Let's start by putting the oscillator mode on double. And then for oscillator 1, I'm going to choose number 1092, which is a saw up from the ARP 2600. And I'll choose 1093 for oscillator 2, which is a saw down from the ARP 2600. Now, if I play oscillator 1, you'll see it's a saw up. Oscillator 2, of course, being a saw down. So if I play them both at the same time, they cancel each other out. We don't hear anything. Now, if I offset the phase of oscillator 2 by 180 degrees, we'll create something interesting. But how do I do that? Because I don't have a phase shift control, but I do have a delay control. Now, if this were some complex sample, all the delay would do would be just that. It would literally delay the sound by some number of milliseconds. But with a simple single cycle sampled waveform, a simple repeating waveform, this delay control essentially acts as a phase shift. So a B3 is 246.9 hertz. And I got that from this chart. I'm not like super smart or anything. If I enter that value into a hertz to millisecond converter, then I know that a hertz value of 246, or an oscillator that's cycling at this pitch, takes about 4 milliseconds to complete one cycle. And that means if I want to shift the phase of oscillator 2 by 180 degrees, I would need to shift it by 2 milliseconds, in other words, half the time. Because if I shifted it by 4, that would just be a 360 degree shift, and we would be right back where we started. So with this now phase shifted 180 degrees and summed with oscillator 1, we have created a square wave. So that's a phase shift for that particular frequency. If I play higher up the keyboard, that phase shift won't be perfect. It won't be a perfect 180 degrees anymore. In fact, you can see that the width gets narrower the higher I go. So I can use that shift in pitch, to create pulse width modulation. And I'll do that by using the frequency offset control. So if I put it on -2, then... So you might be thinking we're done, right? But there's a problem. If I keep the note sustained, then it flips back around, which is not what I want it to do. I want to mimic the kind of pulse width modulation we created in the first 2 episodes. So the way to do that is to use an LFO on oscillator 2 in particular, since that's what we're going to be using to create the pulse width modulation. I'll use a square wave, and I'm going to put the frequency down to 14 because I want it to be at about the same rate that we've been using for our other pulse width modulations. And I also want to offset the polarity. So I now have a unipolar square wave. Now I want to patch that into the pitch of oscillator 2. If I try to patch it in directly, then you'll notice that this control is actually a bit too intense. Let's see what it looks like. So it's a bit strong, right? And by the way, just so you can see why this is working, I should have explained this ahead of time. With this offset at -2 hertz, you can see we're moving in one direction. If I offset it at 2 hertz in the other direction, we move the other way. So basically, I'm using this, not basically, exactly, I'm using this LFO to essentially offset. I keep saying essentially, it's not essentially, this is exactly what we're doing. I'm using the LFO to offset the frequency um, the other way. So we're moving the pulse width modulation the other way. Does that make sense? So before, when I was offsetting it by some negative hertz value, I'm using a unipolar LFO to offset it by a positive hertz value to make it move the other direction. Um, Now, right at this moment, I'm actually not applying any modulation. So let's go ahead and apply some positive modulation to offset our negative hertz value. And and since we already concluded that this is too intense, I instead want to put this back at 0 and use our filter envelope generator to control that intensity. I'm going to put it on 2. The reason I set it up like this is because I actually want to scale this parameter. This is acting as if this modulation source is at full intensity, but I can kind of, in effect, turn down the volume of the modulation source by putting the attack and sustain and everything lower. So I'll put everything at 70. And that way we're not sending this modulation at its full intensity. I'm sending it at 70% of +2. So let's see what that looks like. So we did it. We created pulse width modulation. There is something though that bothers me about this. It's pulse width modulation in the style of the Poly6 when I really wanted to do pulse width modulation in the style of the MS-20. So let me see if I can figure out how to do that. Let's how should I do that? Let's offset. What do we need to change? So I need to look at the pitch. So I'm going in a positive direction by going this way. I basically want to, okay, yeah. By simply shifting this LFO 180 degrees, oop, come on. Then that should work, I believe. Let's see. Yep. So effectively, we're starting out with, since this is unipolar, I'm starting out with no shift in pitch. So we're going in one direction because we are starting off with a pitch offset, which is making the pulse width travel. And then the LFO kicks in by shifting the pitch of the oscillator the other way, in a positive direction, and thus giving me the kind of behavior that I wanted. So there you have it. That is a detailed look, an extremely detailed look into pulse width modulation and pulse width modulation techniques. I would like to thank Duncan McRae again for his donation. It inspired me to make this series and to release it for free. If viewers would like to make a donation, I'll definitely use that as an excuse to make more free material like this. Otherwise, I am going to be working on trying to figure out how to monetize future content. But thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this, and thanks again to Duncan. Take care, everybody.